Hello and welcome to this edition of Talking Crime with me, Danny Shaw, and today I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Assistant Commissioner Rob Beckley from the Metropolitan Police. Rob's work at the moment isn't really connected with the Met. He is the officer in overall command of Operation Resolve. That's the criminal investigation into the Hillsborough Disaster. And I'm going to be talking to Rob about that and also about his lengthy policing career, which has encompassed a series of roles. So Rob, thank you very much for joining me. I can ask you first of all about Operation Resolve. Are we almost at the end of that now?
Well, you mentioned we were set up for the criminal investigations, but also we've been investigating complaints and conduct matters. When Theresa May reopened the investigations after the HIP report and the inquest, we had to take on all the complaints that people on the day made. We're concluding those, wrapping up those reports. Certainly, I'm hopeful that our job as Operation Resolve will end very soon. In fact, we're aiming for the end of March, but we will still continue supporting the route to publication for all these reports that will come out and be published by the Independent Office of Police Conduct. But how long that's going to take is a bit of an unknown matter. The one thing I am grateful for, having done it for now 5.5 years, and I took over from John Stoddard, who'd been doing it for 4 years before me, what I am grateful for is that the recent documentary, I don't know if you saw it, on Anne Williams on ITV.
My son and 95 Liverpool fans did not die in an accident. They were unlawfully killed.
It's given a real personal view of Hillsborough and has been a great asset for me in explaining what Hillsborough's about.
Take us back to when you started Operation Resolve. There would have been a massive material of documents and witnesses and reports to go through. How do you actually begin organising something like that on that scale?
Well, it's been an extraordinary endeavour. I mean, at one point, I had about 200 staff working on it, trawling, discovering evidence, particularly audiovisual evidence that hadn't been forensically looked at in the first instance back in after 1989. But I would say I pay tribute to the Taylor report that was published 6 months after the disaster that nailed many of the basic problems and issues. It did paint the picture. What we've done is add nuance, add depth, covered a lot more ground than the inquiry, but nevertheless the key issues were identified then, and if they had been dealt with properly then, you would not have needed such a large contingent of people working on it when I took over.
I mean, you had 200 people, as you said, at one point. I mean, were they divided up at looking at particular aspects of the inquiry? Because you were looking at the planning, weren't you? You were looking at what happened on the day, decisions that were made, and you were looking at the responses of all sorts of different agencies, not just the police, but other emergency responders. So how did you actually divide? Can you paint a picture of how you actually organised the team?
Well, in fact, the way you do it is very similar to the way you do any major crime. You look at what are the key hypotheses, what's gone on, what are the key hypotheses about what happened, behaviours, actions. You then divide it into manageable chunks and you create actions around it. So you're spot on. Those are exactly the areas we looked at, the planning beforehand, the nature of the different roles of the parties involved, the club, Eastwards, the organisation, the company that the structural engineers had advised the club, the police, the ambulance service, all those who responded afterwards as well, and you do divide it into the journey to the event on the day, events leading up to it, what actually happened, and unpicking what really happened in terms of opening gates, the movement of fans and the movements of the 97. And what we've always got to remember, this was a tragedy that affected 97 as well as many thousands. And of course, many of them had their story to tell. And in this journey, particularly for the inquest, we had to unpick that and really find out what happened to those people on that day. Less relevant to the criminal inquiries, but very relevant to the people who were affected by the disaster.
Because you were providing investigative support for the inquests.
We were, and we weren't formally designated as coroner's officers, but in effect that's the job we were doing. We were, and it turned out to be the longest inquest in English legal history, and it was a massive task. And while you describe how ideally we would chunk it up into nice, careful segments, we would create actions, we'd follow the actions. As the inquest progressed, the team were running to catch up with the mass of required evidence and matters that they would need to look at en masse, all the evidence from, say, all the police officers on duty that day, and find ways of interviewing hundreds of people very quickly in order to be able to present it both to the inquest and then use it for potential criminal proceedings later. It was a massive endeavour.
What was the most challenging aspect of it? Was it the amount of material? Was it the fact, as you said, that you were kind of having to play catch up when the inquest took place, or was it that some evidence you couldn't find or had been destroyed?
I would say actually the most challenging thing was the fact you were on a journey of tragedy, and it was working with or liaising with many people who'd been bereaved or had been significantly affected by the disaster. I think that's the most challenging, and the one thing we always tried to recognise was the humanity of what we were doing. But we had the pictures of the 96 as it was then, but the 97 now on all the walls of the office. We had pictures, their relationships to each other. We tried to remind ourselves constantly of the human beings we were looking at and the context of that investigation. But the secondary challenge, I think, was the scale of it, and having to make witness appeals for matters that had happened many years before, having to work through people's memories, which often with differing accounts, working through those, that was extremely difficult because people do remember it differently sometimes to how it was then playing out, as we were able to discover on some of the audiovisual material we found. So it was that those were specific investigative challenges, memory and scale.
Did you find that there were statements or documents that you looked for and you could locate, and you suspected that some of those had been deliberately concealed or destroyed?
We certainly found documents, and we scoured South Yorkshire Police's basements and things, only actually to find a few weeks, literally 2 weeks before the first criminal trial that we ran against David Duckenfield, we discovered a bag of notebooks, or South Yorkshire Police discovered a bag of notebooks in the basement of Sig Hill, their old headquarters. And so while we scoured and looked, and we often were given absolute assurances that stuff had been looked at, stuff still turned up. Deliberate destruction or hiding of stuff, we never came across specific evidence, although there's suspicions about a videotape that was originally was in the CCTV system at South Yorkshire Police, of Sheffield Wednesday Football Club. But what we actually found was a lot more stuff had been retained because Chief Constable after Hillsborough had passed it to the South Yorkshire Archive, and so there was quite a lot of stuff retained that might not have otherwise have been retained, that we were able to look at. Ultimately, the most reliable evidence turned out to be the audiovisual and the sound recordings that we were able to examine in great depth, certainly in terms of finding out what the movements of people and what some of the happenings, the timings of events was.
So at the end of all this, there were 2 suspects prosecuted, Graham McCrell, who was convicted of health and safety at work breaches, and David Duckenfield, who was acquitted. Do you think that if this investigation had taken place with the same rigour, the same thoroughness, the same endeavour just a few years after the disaster, do you think more people would have been prosecuted?
We actually put up files for 15 individuals and organisations that we felt were culpable for the events of the day. The CPS examined those files and came down to, as you say, the 2 people who appeared before court. I think that had the evidence been gathered early, there's always the potential that those matters could have been progressed. I particularly feel that about Eastwood's, the structural engineers, and the club itself. Both of them dissolved themselves legally after the disaster. Both of them were culpable in the disaster as well, but because they weren't wholly legal entities when we started our investigation, and we sought a lot of advice on that, and we certainly had a file for the club itself, and the club existed as a shell company, so to speak, still on the books of Companies House but not existing. And we actually put the file up with a view that the case could be taken against the football club. The CPS decided it wouldn't be in the interests of public interest to pursue a shell company. But it does, it points to me that certainly there are other players in the system who should have been held to account at the time. Within policing, it's a little bit more complicated in that we are now subject in policing to rigorous health and safety legislation and other legislation that would have certainly applied to many people in the force had it been enacted at the time of the disaster. So we have not. I think now, if we had a similar disaster, many more people involved who did make some very poor decisions would be held culpable under different offences. So it would be a very different thing if it was held under the law now.
There's still a final report to come out from the Independent Office for Police Conduct, I think, and this is looking at disciplinary misconduct matters.
That's right.
And you're supporting that, and that's still ongoing, so you can't say very much about that. But as you say, your work is ongoing. Do you think when you look back at your career that this was the sort of the biggest challenge or the most important investigation that you've overseen?
It certainly has taken the biggest proportion of my career, actually. While I've spent, say, 2 periods of 5 years as a chief officer in individual forces, spending over 5 years on this investigation, it's certainly been for me very significant. I think, you asked about looking back. One of the fascinating things is, while a lot has changed since Hillsborough, I often reflect that there are, in fact, 3 key themes that come out of the investigations and out of the disciplinary work in general themes. I can't obviously, as you say, talk about the individuals involved, but I can talk about the themes that come out from our both in criminal and disciplinary investigation. And the themes are complacency, their lack of leadership in critical moments, but also in general, and organisational defensiveness. And all 3 of them were writ large at Hillsborough and are a risk for policing today. So while people will say, what do you do in dealing with a matter that was 30 years ago? And people do, which is why I mentioned Anne Williams' documentary. It has made people appreciate the human side of what's going on here. But organisationally, there's still stuff that's as relevant today as it was then, and policing really needs to take care about leadership, about being complacent about we think we're doing a good job here, when a good job isn't being done, and also layers of organisational defensiveness that we've seen in recent years.
Is there a specific occasion or incident or example that you can give where you can see that happening, either the defensiveness or the complacency or the lack of leadership?
Well, I'm always fascinated by organisational defensiveness, because people describe it as a binary matter. They sort of say, well, you're either transparent or you're defensive, but it isn't. It's so weighted on defensiveness, and it's a range of issues that I think weight it there. So the simple thing, if you have a problem with policing and you decide you want to ring up and just take it up with somebody, have you ever tried doing that? Getting through on the phone, speaking to the right person, trying to find out what on earth's happened to the matter that you are concerned about. Those bureaucratic barriers to speaking with a human being and actually getting your matter resolved is defensive. It comes across, it feels defensive. The tendency in policing that we've seen in a number of times to say, protect the staff. I don't want to criticise my staff in public. Can also, lend itself to actually being more concerned about how your staff might feel about a matter, rather than actually thinking about the victims or the people on the other side of this.
Is there anything you've got in mind there?
Oh, I've got lots of. I can think of examples, and understandable examples where Ian Blair, after Jean-Charles de Menezes was sadly shot, he was talking about our staff had worked their socks off and things, and yes, they had, but something's gone wrong. We've got to pause and consider that, and there was a real resistance to putting that to the Independent Police Complaints Commission at the time. And I was there. I was watching events. My view was go straight for an independent perspective on this. You've got to take it away, even though it's in the heat of the of terrorist incidents, really significant stuff. If you're going to keep public trust, you still have to make the call that we're not always right, and we have to prove that to others. So I can think of other examples as well, but that's a one from a little while ago that I was closely involved in.
There are certainly some more recent examples, possibly in the Met. But isn't this a bit like you're the football manager? Isn't the golden rule, even after you've been beaten 3-0, you don't do the interview and criticise your players in public. You might do that in the dressing room, but in the public, you either deflect and talk about the referee, or you talk in general terms.
Yeah, but internally you've still got to address the issue, and as you say, and you've still got to manage take your staff on a journey, because I will absolutely repeat the mantra. Many of my colleagues will say that police officers don't go out to do a bad job in each day. They care about the work they're doing, or at least they're going out to do the decent job. But sometimes hard truths have to be said, and that's a difficult task, and it won't always echo well. We're here ultimately to serve the public. They're our first responsibility. Our staff will help us deliver that, and are a very key responsibility, but the service to the public has to come first.
Was one of the other issues that you sort of examined from Operation Resolve around accountability for historical incidents and allegations? And I know you've got a bit of a beef with the word historical or historic as well. that you might want to explain.
Yes. Well, the historic element is it's not historic to many of the people involved. it's still a lived experience. It's live for them. So a better but a cumbersome word is non-recent. It's sort of, but both are describing matters that did happen in the past. But that's the nature of it. So that's it's not a beef actually, and I will occasionally use historic because some matters do become history. At the moment, for many people, some stuff is not history. So I try and be careful with my words without getting obsessed.
But it is a good point that you make, because there is a tendency, I suppose, of people to think of it's actually historical rather than historic, but to think of it as something that's ancient and doesn't matter so much, and it's not a priority, it's not an ongoing issue, no one's at risk, or so actually you may well have a point. I mean, why do you even have to say non-recent or historical at all?
Yes, exactly. I mean, they are matters that have just been left a longer time to be resolved. One of the problems, though, is you asked about what are the issues in that context, and one of the problems is that actually policing is a very immediate activity. On the whole, police officers and police organisations are geared up for dealing with the response to the crisis now. The matters that happened some time ago, it's less easy to marshal a response that delivers an outcome, because outcomes can be very hard to achieve as well. So on the whole, organisations don't like to look back. The police organisations, they just want to move on to the next thing that's on their plate, and they've got a lot on their plates. Gathering a team like ours actually turned out to be slightly easier, purely because we were set up at the time of austerity when police forces were actually looking to offload experienced staff. My team, fortunately, was made up of some superb detectives, because actually forces didn't want them. They had to cut money. Now, that was...
didn't really help the forces, did it?
Well, in the longer term, it didn't. And I think there's real issues echoing back today because of that. But we benefited, Operation Resolve benefited from some great detectives and some really committed staff and experienced staff. If we were setting one up today, that would be such a problem. I don't know what might come out of the blood products review, say. I mean, that's an example. But were there to be serious criminality that needed investigation out of that inquiry, we would struggle as a police service to find a team to locate it anywhere as well, because that was a national problem. It wasn't located in any particular force area. I mean, I can't imagine the Met would jump for joy and wanted to take on that, nor would any specific force. That I use it as a hypothetical example, but it's a really good example of what might still land on police's toes.
Because there's a shortage of detectives or experienced detectives?
A shortage of both detectives and experienced detectives, a shortage of sheer capacity and resource. Forces are struggling to get people through the doors, and certainly with the commitment to increase the number of police officers, which won't take us back up to where we were, but will sort of assuage some of that loss of officers, but it won't assuage the loss of experience. So I think we're in for if we had to set up, and we will at some point, stuff will happen. We won't know when it's going to happen. At some point, we're going to have to set up national inquiries to deal with big stuff. And it might be immediate, or it might have been in the past. When we face that problem, policing is going to have a real headache to find out where they come from, who owns it, who leads it, who's responsible for it, and how it can deliver, and where it can deliver. Lots of questions like that we struggled with for Operation Resolve, but are amplified now in the current environment.
So I want to turn now to an entirely different aspect of your career, Rob. This was after the 9/11 attacks in the early 2000s, and I think you had a role sort of overseeing for policing, community engagement, and also the establishment of Prevent. Now, there is an independent inquiry into the future of Prevent at the moment. Were you actually involved in setting Prevent up?
I was, yes.
And what was the purpose of it?
Well, I was first recruited not to prevent, because prevent didn't exist. I was recruited as I was an assistant chief constable in Hertfordshire Police, and I was, because of my background, I speak a little bit of Arabic, not much, but I can get by. I have an interest in race and Muslim issues, matters, partly because of that, partly because of my own personal interest and activities. So I had a bit of an insight. I'm not an expert by any means, but a bit of an insight into Muslim communities and the issues around that, and that was identified, and I was asked to support David Vaness as he was developing work to counter terrorism, and in effect to come and help liaise and work with Muslim communities in order to try and prevent harm, and also to help manage the investigative processes better by having a better relationship and liaison with Muslim communities. So that's how I started.
And what period was this?
This was about 2002, after 9/11.
But before the London bombings.
But yes, long before the London bombings. But and we, the part of the problem at that time was many in Muslim communities, not a majority by any means, but some in Muslim communities actually did not believe that 9/11 was an act of terrorism. Some of them truly believed it was all a big conspiracy. So there was some big hills to climb in terms of attitudes and understanding in some communities about what we were dealing with, and that's one reason why I went into that work.
Where do you start with something like that? I mean, it's such a huge...
It is actually, and it was. And in fact, what I quickly recognised was we needed to have a barometer on what was going on across the whole country, because it wasn't just London. Because London, David Vaness, even though he had national counter-terrorism responsibilities, it had a London focus. We recognised, though, that what was going on in Bradford or even in where I ended up being a superintendent in Thames Valley, High Wycombe, that big Muslim community there, all of those communities were communities we needed to both understand what was going on and liaise with constructively. So I set up with a colleague of mine, David Tucker, who helped me set up the National Community Tensions Team, which already partly existed, but we sort of expanded it, made it into a sort of community intelligence function to help understand what was going on.
And that was, so you were getting feedback from people in communities?
Yes.
And they were relaying their concerns?
Yes. And incidents, Islamophobia, things like that, we were monitoring. We were trying to understand the temperature out there.
And that hadn't been done before.
It hadn't been done before, not nationally. Given some of the backlash to what had gone on in 9/11 as well, it was critical that we protected Muslim communities as much as found out what was going on. But the idea, and then Prevent developed. Sir David Omand.
So David Omand was the head of intelligence at
he was. Yes, he was. In fact, I can't remember but he was in the Home Office and responsible for counterterrorism and in effect designed the 4 Ps. Which are protect, pursue, prevent, obviously, and Prepare, yes,
Prepare.
Of course.
So it was David Omand's idea.
Yes.
This was in the era of David Blunkett, I think, wasn't it? As
yes.
Home Secretary.
Yes.
So there had to be a better strategy.
Yes.
To deal with terrorism than
Exactly.
currently exists.
Exactly.
And so you sort of took up the Prevent strand.
Yes. And I, for policing, I mean, at the time there was a lot of debate. Should communities run as a strand through all 4 Ps? Because all of them, have a community context to them. Should we actually say it's 4 Ps and a C? That was the sort. You can imagine the sort of bureaucratic debates people are having. But essentially, the importance of communities in the context of counterterrorism and preventing stuff was very clearly identified. So our job in policing was to think, well, what interventions can we make? And that's where clearly the work of the National Community Tensions Team was quite important in just one of the most important things is understand what you're dealing with. And one of our themes at that point was very much around trying to empower communities to prevent themselves. We looked for and we developed links with many community groups to try and encourage them to spread an understanding of the risk of violent extremism, assist people to identify interventions that would work, not just in communities but prisons and elsewhere. And so we tried to create this approach that was around communities preventing the crime themselves in the first place, understanding the issues well enough that they could counter some of the narratives that were going on in those communities. So that was our where it was growing, and some important issues and initiatives were started at that time, which included something that happens now, which is sort of case conferencing. And we developed the concept of case conferencing of the various agencies when somebody was highlighted as a risk. But on the whole, our approach wasn't very top-down. It was bottom-up. It has now morphed into a much more top-down initiative, and I can't talk a lot about it now. I'm not closely involved, but clearly the public debate on that is about public agencies all being marshalled, and the concern is they're acting as spies, for the state.
Toxic brand is the phrase.
It is, which is a shame, because my personal view is a mixture of both, and
it's a mixture of both.
Both building up from the communities. Trust. I can understand. I can understand, but don't agree why government has gone for top down more than bottom up, because bottom up has its risks. You end up with some individuals who can be a bit wayward. You end up with community groups that might not toe the line. It's
and there have been examples of that.
And there have been examples of it. So but there is sort of something where do you take the risk on that? Where do you recognise that yes, some will fail, but a majority might work, and you've got to evaluate and make sure they do work, which is something we moved into later. But top down, it's easier, so much easier for government to pull levers top down. We can tell teachers, we can tell doctors, this is your responsibility, this is how you do it. And that's actually the easier task than working with communities. So I can understand why there's been a top-down approach. But if I had a criticism about the top-down approach, I think it's too narrow, actually. Now, this might seem taking a sort of one area and then going very broad, but my personal view is that all public agencies and private agencies should have a responsibility of community safety, of preventing crime. And it shouldn't just be focused on counterterrorism. They should have a responsibility for identifying problematic people, victims, and also processes and work that creates possibilities for criminality. We all have a duty to prevent crime, whether it's terrorism or child abuse or burglary. How can we actually marshal all the different organisations to do that? And in effect, what we've done, we've picked on one. We picked on terrorism, went for that. And I think we should have gone broader. We should have actually taken the opportunity to say there needs to be a duty of crime prevention on everyone.
So the prevent strategy that we've got at the moment, you think it should stay? I mean, there'd be some calls that kind of tear it up, and the word prevent is putting people off and some. But you're an advocate for it.
Yes, I am. I do feel you've got to work as much with communities, and there has been, and it has moved on a lot. There's the whole tone and nature of some of the debates has changed, partly because the evidence is so clear, and some of the naysayers back in 2002 and 2003 probably would not deny there's a problem with violent extremism. Now some would, but some wouldn't. So the tone has changed, the environment's changed a lot in getting on for 20 years now, but I do think it's important to focus on preventing violent extremism and people moving into terrorism. We've seen, the right wing threat is a real concern, and that needs countering. But as I said a little bit earlier, I don't think we should just focus solely on it as terrorism. Terrorism is a crude label. What is terrorism? But one of the most serious crimes you can do, but it's still a crime. It's still on a spectrum of crime.
We boxed it in.
We have boxed it in. And I think, and without lessening the focus on it, we've got to recognise the harm of other serious crimes is so much more than terrorism. Terrorism is amplified because of the nature of the act. But we as a society, we could do so much better in joining up our response to crime and preventing crime.
Rob, we've run out of time at the moment. We could talk for so much longer, and perhaps we'll come back another day and talk about some of your other experiences. But that's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you for coming in also with an injury to your arm. You weren't trying to arrest someone.
No, I'd like to say I was. In fact, I did once break my ankle trying to arrest somebody, but that was a long time ago. No, this was coming off my bicycle, as prosaic as that, where unfortunately collarbone and AC joint. But it's. I think the pain focuses the mind for an interview such as this.
Rob Beckley, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.
Well, that's all from this edition of Talking Crime. Till the next one, goodbye.